to continue with the program with the presentation of the finalists, and then we will have our winner as the guest speaker. The finalists for the awards, are both with us today, and so we would like to present them with a certificate. The first finalist is, and these are not in any order, but the first finalist is Aniko Bodorowski. Nope. Aniko Bodrowkowski. Help me out. You wouldn't believe I just asked her how to pronounce it, would you? If you would come up and receive your certificate, and I apologize. I thought I had it right, though. Bodrowkowski, right? Bodrowkowski.
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you. Let's walk over here and take a picture. There we go. One more. I don't do this well. One more. Stop talking. I should mention she is a professor at the University of Virginia, and the title of her chapter in a book was Mediating Selma, 1965-2015. In the book, The Shadow of Selma, published in 2018. Thank you. The second finalist is Kiana Whitted, University of South Carolina. The entry was Comics and Emmett Till, which was a chapter in the book Picturing Childhood, Youth in Transnational Comics, published in 2017. If Kiana would come forward for her award.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There we go. All right.
One more. Thank you.
Congratulations. And the winner of this year's Farrar Award is Dr. Gwyneth Mellinger. She is the director of the School of Media Arts at James Madison University. Let me give you a little background. The article is titled, An Idea Before Its Time, Charles S. Johnson, Negro Columnist. It was published in a 2018 issue of Journal of Civil and Human Rights. The Farrar contest was judged by a panel of 3 historians with expertise in civil rights and media history. Mellinger was commended for the depth of her research, use of primary sources, and an insightful analysis that helps extend the time frame of the Black freedom struggle beyond the traditionally assigned early years of the movement. As her abstract indicates, quote, in the mid-1940s, Claude Barnett of the Associated Negro Press developed a proposal for Fisk University sociologist Charles S. Johnson to write a column for daily newspapers. Had the plan succeeded as they imagined, Johnson's column, titled A Minority View, would have integrated the opinion pages of white newspapers. Instead, her chronicle of the 3-year effort to establish the column reveals unwelcoming white editors doomed the plan from the start. She concludes, the failure of A Minority View to reach a mass audience of white newspaper readers is a pointed demonstration that American journalism remained intractably segregated at mid-century. According to Dr. Philip Jeter, Professor Emeritus, Winston-Salem State University, who judged the contest and is with us today, raise your hand, Phil. He commented, An idea before its time illustrates how little the 1940s relationship between Americans of African descent and American daily newspapers had changed since Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm described the situation in the initial issue of the first black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, in 1827. Gwyneth Mellinger shows how the efforts of Associated Negro Press founder Claude Barnett and Dr. Charles S. Johnson, a well-respected University of Chicago sociologist and Black College president with General Education Board / Rockefeller Foundation funding, to plead the cause of race in periodic opinion columns met with little success from the intractably segregated daily newspaper industry of the time. Another judge, Dr. Bobby Donaldson, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Research Center for Civil Rights and History, and is present with us. Dr. Donaldson, there we are. He commented, in a meticulously researched essay, Mellinger offers a captivating assessment of Charles S. Johnson as a civil rights journalist in the 1940s. Mellinger's project also offers greater insight about the inner workings of the Associated Negro Press and Claude Barnett's role in shaping the nation's public opinion on the race question. The third judge was Dr. Patricia Sullivan, who could not be with us today. Let's give these judges a hand, please, for their work in evaluating the work. And we invite Dr. Mellinger to come up to receive her award and to present us with today's presentation. Okay, sit back down and we'll go over here and take a picture. Okay.
Here we go. One more. Good.
Thank you. Dr. Mellinger. The award also comes with a check for $1,000, which she will be receiving soon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm usually sitting in this audience watching someone else receive this award and give a talk, and I'm so happy to be able to meet the Farrar family. I want to thank them for making this opportunity possible, and the award selection committee for seeing value in my scholarship. My research travel for this article was supported by a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation Archives, as well as the McKearns Research Grant, which is awarded by the American Journalism Historians Association. I also would like to acknowledge Mike Ezra, who's never been to one of these symposia, who founded the Journal of Human and Civil Rights 5 years ago as a forum for interdisciplinary social justice research. Media historians sometimes have trouble breaking into journals outside our specialty, and I was grateful to find another venue for research on media and civil rights. I also would like to thank Ken Campbell and the other organizers of the Media and Civil Rights History Symposium, past and present, who have worked throughout the years to make this event possible. This particular community of scholars has been enormously important to me and to others who pursue research about both media history and civil rights. In fact, my symposium paper in 2017 was an early version of the journal article that is honored today. And because this article is returning home, so to speak, and may seem a bit familiar to some in the room, I'm going to focus a bit more on the research process and its context, in addition to discussing the scholarship itself. Researching and writing this article deepened my understanding of the black and white presses during the 1940s and of the institutional racism dividing American journalism at mid-century. As I have discovered before, the color line in journalism was resilient when challenged. This scholarship explores a post-war collaboration between Claude Barnett, the founder of the Associated Negro Press, and Charles Spurgeon Johnson, one of the leading intellectuals of the first half of the 20th century, in their attempt from 1945 to 1948 to place a column written by Johnson entitled A Minority View in daily newspapers. The column, which had indirect funding of the General Education Board, a Rockefeller philanthropy, would have been free for newspapers to use. Had their plan succeeded, a Minority View would have been the first regularly published column written by an African American to appear in the white daily press. It would have integrated the op-ed page 2 decades before Carl Rowan received his contract for a syndicated column in 1965. Barnett is better known to us media historians as a prominent figure in the history of the black press. He founded the Associated Negro Press in 1919 as a counterpoint to the wire services that distributed content to white papers, and his work shaped the black press for 40 years. However, Johnson is more important to African American history and American history generally. When I first encountered Johnson in my research, I was only vaguely aware of him, but I now understand Johnson to be one of the central figures of the pre-Brown civil rights movement. Johnson was a sociologist who trained under Robert Park, the father of sociology, at the University of Chicago, and from 1948 until his death in 1956, Johnson was the first African American president of Fisk University in Nashville. During the 1920s, Johnson was research director of the National Urban League and edited its journal Opportunity. In 1927, Johnson moved to Nashville to head the Department of Sociology at Fisk. He later founded the Institute for Race Relations there, and by the time he enters my research narrative at the end of World War II, he had written or edited 10 books. Johnson's influence during the 1940s included his co-authorship of the so-called Durham Manifesto, the 1942 position paper by moderate black leaders in the South, and his service as a founding director of the Southern Regional Council. He contributed research to both Myrdal's American Dilemma and the litigation that culminated in Brown v. Board. Johnson was pivotal. Johnson was not a journalist, but he and Clive Barnett intersected with my research almost by accident, given that most of my work now focuses on white Southern editors and their defense of segregation following the Brown decision. Although I approach trips to an archive with a plan and certain expectations about what the archive will yield, I have learned that I'm really just along for the ride, that correspondence and other documents will sometimes take me in unexpected directions. Discovering Charles Johnson and his collaboration with Claude Barnett while doing research about white racism in journalism is one of those serendipitous outcomes. I first became curious about Johnson about 10 years ago while doing research on the Southern Education Reporting Service. The SERS, which used a network of white journalists to report on local and state responses to Brown, had a biracial board of directors that included Johnson and P.B. Young, editor of the Norfolk Journal and Guide, as well as segregationist Tom Waring, editor of the Charleston News and Courier, and Virginius Dabney of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who was more moderate but was still an opponent of integration. I'd read about Johnson's participation on the SERS board in a number of archives, including the Amistad collection at Tulane, where the SERS records are located, and in the Dabney and Waring papers. And I was struck by white board members' condescending and even mildly derisive treatment of Johnson, who was in fact the most accomplished person in the room. Intrigued, I traveled to Nashville to read the Johnson Archive's substantial record on his SERS board membership, hoping that Johnson had committed to paper his thoughts about the experience of being on the SERS board with white people who barely tolerated him. He didn't. But when I finished my work in Johnson's SERS files, I had time to look at other materials suggested by the finding aid. And this finding aid is outstanding. It itemizes the correspondence of a leading black intellectual of the first half of the 20th century. And it's a wonderful archive, as Johnson corresponded with many people who shared his interests, and the documents are organized and accessible. In addition, there are pleasant surprises. The poet Arna Bonton was a Fisk librarian, and a book order by him, signed by him, was mixed in with Johnson's correspondence and fell out on the table. And I thought, oh my gosh, look at this. his autograph, I put it back. But in addition, Aaron Douglas, who was an art department chair, painted murals in campus buildings. The Fisk campus is just a delightful place to be. It was in Johnson's correspondence with Barnett, which spanned 1935 to 1947, that I saw the first reference to a minority view. And then at the end of my scheduled time in the Fisk archive, I found in the part of the collection where Johnson's writings were archived 6 folders containing the mostly unpublished columns, about 60 of them, that Johnson wrote for white newspapers. I made a second trip to Nashville to go through that material, which, as far as I can tell, no one has used in research. It also had become clear from reading the related correspondence that the General Education Board's involvement was important and that the GEB had provided some kind of funding for the project by making grants to Fisk. So I later traveled to Westchester, New York, to the Rockefeller Foundation collection to use the material there. I was astonished at the detail in the General Education Board archive. This is an archive researcher's dream come true. In addition to a complete record of correspondence about the column proposal, which Barnett had begun discussing in the early 1940s, GEB staff created a report on every meeting with Barnett and Johnson and archived their internal memos discussing Barnett, Johnson, and the column. In addition, the archives of the Associated Negro Press, which includes Claude Barnett's correspondence archive, have been digitized, and I was able to do that research online. When I began to write, however, I had a great deal of information about a somewhat unlikely topic, a journalistic failure. I was challenged to develop a historical narrative about a non-event. I doubted that many biographers, and I mean many biographers, and researchers who have written about Barnett and Johnson before me merely missed a minority view. And so I assumed they had intentionally ignored it. Even if I took the contrary position that the reason for the column's failure was important, I worried that the premise of the article was too abstract. Racism was clearly a factor. It was the reason a column offering an African American view was needed, and the reason a black intellectual needed to write it. It was also, indisputably, the reason that no black columnists were being published on the op-ed pages of the white press, and the reason that white editors would not publish Johnson's column as a regular feature. But how to demonstrate that? When I began writing, I wasn't sure I would produce something that could be published. So what is the non-story of a minority view? Barnett's idea for the column was both practical and visionary. Barnett understood the inability of the African American press to reach a national white audience, and he correctly predicted the eventual influence of the white press in changing white attitudes and public policy related to race. He also offered white newspapers a credible and moderate African American voice in Charles Johnson. So in presenting a historical argument for why a minority view failed to reach a mass audience, it is important to explore the obstacles, both systemic and improvised, that Barnett and Johnson encountered as they tried to share an African American perspective with readers of the white daily press. From 1945 to 1948, Johnson and his staff at Fisk prepared more than 60 columns on a range of topics, but most of them related to racial challenges in post-war America. Although just a few papers ran any of the columns and none made it a regular feature, neither Barnett nor Johnson acknowledged the futility of the effort while they were involved in it. Barnett, whose Associated Negro Press distributed the columns to perhaps 65 newspapers, believed that even if the primary audience for a minority view were the white editors who rejected the column, those editors, as arbiters of majority opinion, would be exposed to Johnson's perspectives. The columns, even if they remained unpublished under this logic, would inform both the content of daily newspapers and the trajectory of U.S. race relations. Quote, "I am confident," Barnett wrote to Johnson's assistant in 1946, "that these articles are proving enlightening, even if not printed by these various papers which are receiving them." Barnett conceived of the column at an important juncture in the black struggle for equal rights. As World War II came to a close, with African American gains toward full participation in military service and the admission in 1944 of the first black journalist to the White House Press Corps, Barnett was optimistic that great progress on civil rights was imminent. He was also deeply impressed by Johnson, who could communicate with both academics and lay people, white and black, and Barnett believed that the insight of a black intellectual of Johnson's stature, if it were available to the white readership of daily newspapers, would be persuasive. Quote, "Daily papers could wield great influence," Barnett wrote. "If white people understood the problems which colored people face, those who are just and thoughtful would have a totally different attitude toward those problems. This is true of the North as it is of the South." Although Johnson shared Barnett's vision, he really didn't have time to write a weekly column, and his failure to meet deadlines was a source of tension during the project's 3 years. He had turned down an offer from Barnett to write a regular article for the black press, but reconsidered when Barnett suggested that they instead develop a column for daily newspapers. Although Johnson, as a scholar, had conditional access to elite white audiences, the prospect of writing for popular white audiences, which typically were placed off limits by the white gatekeepers at the head of daily newspaper newsrooms, was something different entirely. Johnson did not hesitate to take on a commitment that he and his staff would struggle to fulfill, and even after it became apparent that the column would not be a success, he continued to write sporadically out of loyalty to Barnett and a hope that the column eventually would catch on. Most of Johnson's columns spoke to the American racial condition at mid-century, and the tone was thoughtful and moderate but frank. For example, he wrote, quote, "Despite the greatest campaign in American history to impress upon the public the meaning of freedom and democracy, there's been an almost amazing public and official tolerance of racist demagoguery." Some things haven't really changed. And sometimes the topic had an international angle. Quote, "The ex-premier of England, Mr. Winston Churchill, speaking unofficially and with an official tone at Fulton, Missouri, has made an appeal for Anglo-Saxon bilateralism as a guarantee against post-war Soviet hegemony in Europe and Asia." Two dimensions of this story were particularly intriguing to me. One was Barnett and Johnson's interaction with the General Education Board in seeking financial support for the column, and the other was Johnson's interaction with white editors whom he solicited to publish the columns. First, the funding. Barnett initially imagined an extensive enterprise with the mailing of columns each week to newspapers all over the country, but the Associated Negro Press did not have the budget to underwrite the project. Both Barnett and Johnson had relationships with the Rockefeller-endowed General Education Board, particularly with Jackson Davis, a white Southerner who administered GEB programs on African American education and welfare. Because the GEB routinely funded initiatives at Fisk, Davis met and corresponded frequently with Johnson. Barnett, who was an active alumnus of the Tuskegee Institute, also sought GEB support for programs related to his alma mater and to African American agriculture. And so, in 1944, Barnett pursued funding for the column with Davis, who forwarded the proposal to Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times and a Rockefeller Foundation trustee, who advised Rockefeller Philanthropies on press matters. In his documentation of their meeting, Davis wrote that Sulzberger, quote, "confirmed our doubts and also shared our feelings that the press was not a field which the board ought to touch." In an important twist, Sulzberger had cautioned against both direct funding to the Associated Negro Press and the minority view concept, but he was a fan of Johnson, and he suggested providing additional funding to Fisk for Johnson's work on the sociology of race. Sulzberger, who understood how white editors would respond to the suggestion that they place the column in their newspapers, believed that special features by African American writers from outside the community would stigmatize the content. Quote, Negro columns in white papers would have certain value but might tend to introduce a distinction which is not intended, Davis reported. It is also important that these articles should represent the constructive side of Negro effort and thought and not the protest side. The same day, Davis met with Johnson, who was in New York, and discussed the column project and the GEB's interest in limiting the scope of its funding for a minority view to a grant paid to Fisk. Despite Sulzberger's concerns about the column, Davis and Johnson agreed that GEB funds would be used to support the project. According to Davis's notes, Johnson, who was preparing a publication called A Monthly Summary of Events and Trends in Race Relations, the publication of the Institute for Race Relations at Fisk, was undaunted by the prospect of preparing a weekly article. Davis wrote, quote, he is assembling information and distributing it as part of his regular work, and said that he could do what Barnett wishes if he had a good person to assist him with the gathering and preparation of material. Although Johnson would not be able to fulfill that commitment, we can document his intention to write the column on a regular schedule 2 years before he assumed the Fisk University presidency. At this point, Fisk replaced the Associated Negro Press as the official steward of the column initiative. The GEB awarded Fisk a $5,000 grant in 1944 for staff support for Johnson's work as chair of the sociology department. Yet all concerned, except for Sulzberger, understood that the grant would support a column written by an African American and offered for free to white daily newspapers. And although the Associated Negro Press had no direct role through the GEB, Johnson agreed to use grant funds to reimburse Barnett for managing and distributing the column. This sort of backroom deal to fund the column provided support without attaching the General Education Board's public endorsement. A second important dimension of the column's history, one that exposed the racial barriers in journalism, was the communication between Johnson and the white editors who were offered the column. Before the Associated Negro Press mailed a national solicitation with sample columns in January 1945, Johnson wrote a letter about the columns only to Southern daily newspaper editors he believed to be racially moderate. What's interesting to me about this is Johnson's tentative tone and language. Mind you, this is one of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century. But his tentative tone and language was interesting, as he suggested that white Southern editors grant him space in their newspapers. And this enacted the social customs governing interracial social contact in the mid-century South. And it also contrasted sharply with the solicitation letter that was mailed to editors all over the country. Johnson's letter to Southern editors opened with a disclaimer that quote, this note is written somewhat apologetically because it has some personal implications, owing to a somewhat unusual circumstance and proposal. The letter referenced, quote, the idea of a column that might be carried in perhaps a few of the progressive newspapers of the South, giving, out of a somewhat dispassionate social science background, a minority or Negro interpretive slant on certain current social issues. Johnson then directly addressed the implications of his race. Quote, I realize that the idea of itself is full of problems, for there are many risks involved in the effort to add clarification for the public on an issue, especially if the comment comes from an unexpected or somewhat questionable quarter. From some of their points of view, however, if well done, a minority view that is not too embittered and fractious might be considered desirable, notably in facilitating the difficult process of interracial communication and understanding. There is, however, always the sobering thought that a venture of this sort might lack journalistic value. This self-doubt by a leading intellectual was followed by an even more self-effacing statement about his qualifications to write the columns, samples of which were forthcoming for the editor's review. Quote, although I feel fairly secure in my access to factual material and in a reasonable amount of experience in this field, I have no illusions about the value of these personal advantages to a newspaper and its public. If you think that the idea has merit, I would greatly value your suggestions on the character, content, and slant of the articles to make them more newsworthy. If you think the whole idea falls outside the scope of your newspaper, or for that matter, any newspaper, it will not be a major personal disaster, and I would not in the least mind your saying so. This first-person appeal, in which Johnson uses a series of disclaimers to ask white Southerners for a hearing, suggested that he understood that at this moment in the history of American race and journalism, some Southern editors would find the column proposal presumptuous or even audacious on racial grounds. Johnson expected a better response from editors in the North. Indeed, the solicitation mailed by the Associated Negro Press to newspapers across the U.S. framed racial tension as a post-war issue pertinent to all and described at some length the role of the press in a dispassionate discussion of race. Then, having buried the lead, the letter introduced Johnson as just the person to educate the public and asked the editor to consider a regular column by him. Sample columns were attached. Surviving responses from editors who received the solicitations are few, but I believe I have accounted for all of them. The handful of letters and archives offer a sample of editors' reactions. Virginius Dabney of the Richmond Times-Dispatch wrote Barnett thanking him for the columns and promising a response, but no other correspondence from Dabney is in the archives. R.L. McGrath of the Seattle Times wrote that, quote, "The samples sent are interesting and should be effective, but he asked for a list of other papers that had published Johnson's columns so he could check on local reaction." Erwin Canham of the Christian Science Monitor declined to consider the columns because his own paper originated its opinion articles. The two most detailed responses to the initial mailing both emphasized the wartime newsprint rationing, which had been imposed in 1943 and had indeed restricted space in daily newspapers. In fact, many newspapers had shrunk the space for content other than news and advertising. Ted Dealey of the Dallas Morning News wrote that the sample articles were, quote, "clear-headed and impartial and that they might serve a constructive purpose under normal circumstances." However, emphasizing that he was not making an excuse, quote, "We simply don't have sufficient newsprint to start running such a series, although we find nothing objectionable in them and although we think they are very well done." Mark Etheridge of the Louisville Courier-Journal also mentioned the newsprint shortage in his response, but his staff's analysis of the sample columns raised editorial concerns about such issues as the column's timeliness. Although the columns were well written and astute, and a few presented new information and perspectives, Etheridge was concerned about the essay format of a minority view, which was more suitable for magazines, he said, and the fact that the columns were written far in advance, quote, "far in advance of publication and without the topical timeliness usual in newspaper columns. The concern about differences in journalism style and standards, which was a product of segregation in the profession, was a factor in editors' generally chilly reception to a minority view. But the issue of timeliness had practical implications as well. Many columns were undated and addressed general topics without a clear peg to recent news. Under the distribution network of the Associated Negro Press, Johnson would, in theory, mail a column to meet a weekly deadline at the ANP headquarters in Chicago. Then Barnett would send it on to newspapers on the mailing list. By the time a column reached a newsroom, at least a week had passed since Johnson mailed it from Nashville. In fact, correspondence between Johnson and Barnett indicated that during the life of the project, Johnson or his staff often sent multiple columns at a time, compounding the timeliness issue. In 1945, soon after the initial solicitation letter by Barnett, the Kansas City Star published a column from the sample packet, and the Des Moines Register featured a piece condensed from an article by Johnson. In February 1946, the Milwaukee Journal ran a column about the impact of automation on Southern agriculture. The heaviest documented use of the column occurred that spring when the Minneapolis Star-Journal and Tribune ran the column at least 4 times, 2 of them when syndicated columnist Walter Lippmann was on vacation. That's it, 4 papers. The failure of a minority view to reach a mass audience of white newspaper editors is a pointed demonstration that American journalism was, in fact, segregated at mid-century. With historical perspective unavailable to Barnett and Johnson, a minority view was clearly doomed from the outset. For one thing, they likely underestimated white antipathy toward the black press following the Double V campaign. Virginius Dabney, for example, joined Westbrook Pegler, the columnist, in condemning civil rights activism during the war as unpatriotic. And although Barnett and Johnson had deep familiarity with racism in both its overt and subtle forms, they did not fathom that daily newspapers were decades away from easily and routinely welcoming non-white journalists into newsrooms. For some newspapers, the editorial pages, where the newspaper's voice and authority resided, would be even slower to integrate than the staffing of the news pages. As mentioned in 1965, Carl Rowan, generally regarded as the first African American to receive a syndicate contract for opinion, was hired by the Chicago Daily News and Publishers Newspaper Syndicate to write 3 columns a week. Not until 1993 did the New York Times, Sulzberger's paper, make Bob Herbert its first African American columnist. Barnett and Johnson knew they were attempting to knock down a racial barrier, but they did not fully understand that in the 1940s, their column proposal set a depth charge beneath daily journalism's status quo. Thank you.
First of all, if we could thank our speaker, Professor Mellinger. Can we give her another round of applause, please? We have a few historians in the room. So I was
How intimidating.
wondering if perhaps you had questions regarding this piece, the process of the production of this research that we can have answered while our esteemed winner is in front of you.
There's a relatively recent title out about the Associated Negro Press columnist organization, and I'm wondering if that work or that project, I'm not sure how that timed out with your research, but I know for me that was an interesting development.
Are you talking, this is Gerald Horne's book?
Yes, the one book that kind of recaps all the different efforts that were with that service.
When I'm saying that, I was fairly certain that, and when I was at Fisk, Gerald Horne is a very prolific author. And, yeah, I mean, he keeps cranking out the books. And when I was at Fisk the first time, one of his graduate students was there working on another project that was completely unrelated. But in any case, his was one of the books that I was referring to when I said it did not mention a minority view. And so I had to believe that, and there was also one, his first name was Patrick, Johnson biography, and co-authored with a woman named, I think, Mary Beth Gassman.
Yes, research on HBCUs.
Yeah, so I assume these people went through all of the archives that I was going through, and that's why I assumed that other people had seen this and just passed on it. But in any case, I did look at Horne's book, and it did come out while I was writing this, and I thought, oh my God, I saw it. It popped up in an email as a recommendation, and I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if somebody's done it. You know, that's the first thing I thought was that a minority view would be in there, and it's not. So, thank you.
Yes, no.
It was interesting that you kind of alluded to the timeliness issue and then also maybe the quality issue. So yes, obviously segregation in journalism is a problem, but I mean that there could be other factors at play. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yes, and I did not in my talk here talk about the newsprint shortage, which was a real thing. It was a real issue. But I have to believe that the offer of a free column, newsprint shortage or no newsprint shortage, had they really wanted to run the column, it wouldn't have mattered. The issue of timeliness, I thought this was odd because the timeliness issue was raised in response to sample columns, which of course were not timely. And so, I mean, there was a sample packet of, I believe, 6 or 8 columns that was sent to all of these editors. And so the timeliness issue, but they did have problems because of Johnson. I mean, he was a leading researcher. He was doing international travel. He was on all of these boards. He was involved with UNESCO. He was doing all of these things. And then he was named the president of Fisk University. And so he really didn't have time to do this. And so he had all these research assistants who were trying to write columns from notes he would leave before he would leave for Japan or something like that. And so the timeliness issue, there were 2 parts of it. There was the just sort of the initial excuse, I would call it an excuse for why we don't want to run the column because of the timeliness issue. But then there was this other timeliness issue that was real, that was created by the fact that Johnson just couldn't keep the columns coming on a regular schedule. And so, in any case. Then there is also this idea of, well, these columns, and we see this in journalism later, when African Americans are being hired into white newsrooms because it suddenly is politically expedient in the 1960s and 70s, then we still see this thing, well, this just doesn't quite feel like white journalism sort of a thing that, yeah.
Let's thank Professor Mellinger very much for speaking for us.
Thank you.
As I trip over my words here at the end of a very exciting but tiresome 3-day event, I wanted to thank everybody for coming and joining us. Those of you who attended and presented at both sides of our conferences. It was a wonderful opportunity for us to exchange ideas, for the graduate students to engage with the scholars who have been here and been around the block and have their ideas to share, and the opportunity for a fresh brain spark, as my daughter likes to put it, right? And the Farrar family, can we give them a round of applause, please? Without Professor Farrar, this event would not be happening on its own, so we greatly appreciate your continued support. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Tom and Bobby Donaldson. Tom Reichert, Dean of the College of Information and Communications. Thank you very much for your sponsorship. And Bobby, standing over there, thank you very much for your ongoing support as well. As I was walking across from the SJMC and seeing all of the dates, I learned a new fact, which was 10 years to the day before I was born, Rosa Parks was arrested. And I didn't know that happened on December 1st, 1955. And that was exactly 10 years before I was born. So a new fact, even just walking across the land bridge. So thank you for situating that knowledge in my head. And I'm sure there's so much more that we can stand to learn by spending some time in the exhibit on our way out. We have been asked to be done by 1:30 so the students can go on spring break. We're paying them extra to hold the library open today for us, so just remember, harken back to your days as an undergrad and what that was like to be held by a bunch of old folks talking about history, waiting to go somewhere warm and lovely and wonderful with some fruity drinks, right? So I want to thank you all again for coming to both of our conferences and for engaging with each other in this ongoing, exciting scholarly dialogue. And we invite you back to the University of South Carolina, our famously hot city of Columbia, whenever you can. It's a little bit chilly, but it is not North Dakota. So that's very nice. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay.